We are live.
Great, fantastic. Okay, welcome everyone to this sunny Sydney morning. I am absolutely delighted to have Richard Bradshaw with me today to talk about his automation in testing class, which is coming to Sydney on the 21st to the 23rd of October. Good morning, Richard, or should I say good evening?
Yeah, good evening. It's 11 o'clock here, or just after. It's prime time for me, though. This is my peak performing hours.
Great, fantastic. Well, listen, thanks so much for joining us. I am so excited to have this class coming to Sydney in Australia. It's to me like really the class to be taking with respect to automation and testing. And I know I've known you for a while, and Mark Winteringham, who will be he's the co-writer of this class, co-creator, should I say. And, both of you just absolutely stoked you're coming here. But I just wanted to give folks a bit of a chance and opportunity to understand a bit about what the class is about. So, it'd be great if you could just give us an overview of the class and sort of what you feel makes it different to, say, a typical, Selenium testing class.
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head for the start. So this class isn't based on a specific tool. So that's the best thing about this. But breakdown of the class. So the class is experiential. So one of the best courses I ever went on was Problem Solving Leadership with Jerry Weinberg. And that class is 5.5 days, but you don't know how it goes. It's completely based on what happens in the room. And I wanted to recreate that in the space of automation. So what we do over the 3 days is we introduce you to a piece of software. And this isn't some 10-year-old DOS program. This is a real modern application that me and Mark Winteringham have built, which is called RESTful Booker Platform. It's a React microservice-based application deployed in Docker and hosted in K8s and all that fancy jazz that Mark works really hard to do. And we introduce you to that and we say, look, we're a business and we need to bring some automation into our business. What should we do? And we literally go on the journey of assessing risk. We break down those risks. We assess our testability. So day one is mostly focused on testability. We try and understand the system, the stakeholders, the product, the people, who's on your team, what skills do you have, how testable is this application? And then for day two, we start to look a lot more at automated checks. So we have a look at what we should automate, what we shouldn't. And day two is half planning strategy, half hacking. And we call it hacking because we leave you be. If you told me that you think the best thing to do is a web automated check using Selenium for the login flow, I will help you write that check. If you turned around and said you want to do some JavaScript automation because you think you can mitigate the risk there, I will help you do that. If you want to do some API stuff, we will help you do that. So
what happens if you don't know what to do? What do you do then?
If you don't know what to automate, well, we would give you a bit of nudge because obviously we can, as the owners of this business, I can tell you which parts of the business are making us the most money. Or the most important to us. So hopefully that will trigger some creativity. And then you get to choose and go ahead. But then day three is where we have a twist. So theory behind automation and testing is a big focus on tools that support testing. So day three, we set you 5, 6, 7 different challenges depending on the room. And you have to use software to solve them. So these are testing goals, test ideas that you can't execute without tools. So it could be you download a proxy, it could be a command line, it could be you need developer tools, it could be you write your own tool. Whatever it is, in the space of AIT, they're classed as automation. So that's the whole 3 days. We break it down into 4 key levels to make it short and answer. I could have gone with the short answer first, but never mind. So we focus on strategy, creation, usage, and education. Those are the 4 things we focus on.
Can you break down sort of a bit about what you mean by those? So what do you mean by strategy?
Anne-Marie, that's exactly what I wanted you to do. So the strategy side of it is, no one ever just sits down and automate. Even if we think there's some companies out there that are doing that, there'll be some plan in their head. Someone will have had some bright idea that that's the right thing to do. Take the existing test cases and automate them. That's their strategy. So we like to talk about what the benefit is. So what are we trying to achieve? I think the echo comes from Anne-Marie's side, so maybe mute.
I'll turn on my side. Hang on. No more questions from me. Hang on. Try now.
All right, Dave, we'll see if it's any better. Actually, I wonder if I can mute Anne-Marie. There we go. So I'll mute Anne-Marie. So yeah, the idea behind the strategy side of it is, as I said, there will always be a strategy. It's just making it explicit. So we have a big emphasis on, once you've understood your testability, that infers your strategy. So if you don't have any API skills in your team, then identifying a whole suite of API checks without the skills to do it is obviously going to be different with a team that has the skills to go and build them. So that now impacts your strategy. You can allocate the 5 days or weeks or whatever it is to train someone on API tools, or you can change your strategy and go for another layer above. But to really define your strategy, you need to be able to measure your testability. So that's why we focus day one on massively understanding our testability, because all those little pieces. So what layers can we get at? What skills do the people have? What technology is our product written in? Where is our product hosted? Who are our stakeholders? What do they know about automation? What don't they know about automation? What are they after from us? Are they after faster execution, or are they after more coverage? What is it they're looking for? So if we can collect all that information, we can usually define a direction to take. So that's what we mean by strategy.
Oh, thanks. I'm back on. Okay. I'm glad you looked at testability. Do you have an understanding, like you talked about the different aspects, but why is that so important? I mean, we don't hear people talking about testability a lot within organizations. So is this sort of the missing link, do you think?
Yeah, I think testability is one of the most fundamental things that everyone talks about, but never knowingly does so. So a lot of people don't realize that everything is, testability. So for anyone who's not aware of it, your ability to test is the simplest definition. So everything that impacts your ability to test will in turn impact your ability to automate. So therefore, if you can understand testability, and there's very models out there. We go through a few models in the class, going back for the very first one I saw from James Back, and then looking more recently at the work of Ash Winter and Rob Meany with their 10 Ps, and we have our own little model for it as well. But within the class, we focus mostly on projects. So how much time do you have? If you've only got a week, obviously going for a full-blown automation strategy in a week is not really a smart idea. If you've got a 6-month project, then you're probably better off, you've got more time to decide what to do. So that's the project side. The product side, obviously, what product is it? Is it a legacy system? Is it written in modern new tools? Sorry, not the technology. Is it some sort of SaaS problem? Is it cloud hosted? Is it a mobile app? Is it an IoT? What is the product? Technology, as we've mentioned, what's it written in? If it's written in React, that's obviously going to mean there might be other tools that are out there for you. So to go back to your original point, I think a lot of people are aware of, they're asking the right questions, but they've never framed it as testability. I don't know if you've had similar experiences.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. It's not necessarily that they think about testability per se, but they might be sort of thinking those questions, but they might not have vocalized those questions, and knowing how to go about asking those questions is something that is really valuable.
We have actually a funny thing in the class. I'll let you mute yourself. I think it's easier if you can. if you can toggle yourself on and off.
Okay. So if you, I'm just on that subject of testability and sort of working with the different types of testing, Richard, do you go into sort of the different, typical types of testing, for example, unit testing versus integration testing and system testing, or is it, does it look at those different aspects?
Yeah, so I'll let you mute yourself, Anne-Marie. It's easier for you to turn yourself on and off when you want to talk. Perfect. So what we actually do is we start a layer above. So a lot of people, I believe, are biased by picking the type of testing that they want to do. Whereas what we do in the class is we identify the risk and then we reverse engineer that risk. Well, not reverse engineer it, but we go backwards from that risk to identify the right layer that we can automate that on, which is where the testability mapping comes into it. And we do something in the class called visual task analysis, where we map a user journey or a flow or a behavior that we're trying to automate up and down the system. And then that allows us to pinpoint exactly where we think we can mitigate the risk that we're interested in. So that usually leads us to spotting where we can put the automated check. And then what we do is we really push people. And this has been quite a tricky part of the class. So for example, the system we use has a login. So you always get the scenario that we should do a successful login. And then we say, well, what do you mean by successful login? Like, oh, well, the user can log in. And it's like, well, what happens when the user logs in? Well, you get a form. Does the form look correct? Well, yes, it does. Okay, well, do you want to test for that? Well, it's part of login, so yes, okay. Well, what happens when you submit the form? Well, we hit the API. So do you want to test that the right data is sent to the API? Oh, yeah, we definitely want to do that. And then we get down to, well, do we want to check if the credentials are correct? Are we passing the hash correct? Are we giving a cookie back? Are we setting the token? And we break down all those parts. And then we take this simple high-level risk of login and we break it down to 5, 10, 15 different checks that could be automated. And then we fall back to the testability again. Do we have the skills to automate that? If we don't, we accept the risk and maybe go to a layer above, or me and Mark call them seams, go to a seam above where we do have the skills to automate that scenario. But people find that really challenging because they're so used to treating it as a behavior that the user does, that they're so used to being the user as opposed to looking at the stack and seeing where we can mitigate that risk using all the advancements from automation tools that are out there and test libraries and frameworks and so forth.
Okay, so that makes sense to me. What about if you're sort of working in as a developer and you're seeing a lot of within your organization sort of a greater emphasis on testing, and some of the things that you might be starting to ask to do is to think about how you might perform test automation. And if you haven't done that before, that can be sort of quite a sort of different concept to, say, coding, programming product, right? So how do you cater for that in your course?
Well, I think we cater for that because we go on that whole journey. You know, it's not just to sit down and use the tool. We go on that whole flow of picking up an application from scratch, not knowing anything about it or very little about it, and going on the journey of discovering about it, asking the questions to find out what's important, what's useful, and then in turn identifying the checks to create. And developers have a fantastic advantage. Obviously, they might not have as much skills in the testing side of it, which obviously we can coach them, and in the class, because we are going on that journey, they get awareness into that way of thinking. But then when it comes to writing the code, obviously they're leaps and bounds above anyone. I'm a very skilled automation engineer, but like a developer would, absolutely, to defeat me with their skills that they have, because you need to know very little of a programming language to be a very good automator, but you need to know a hell of a lot about a language to be a very good developer. Oh, at least I think so. There'll be some developers that will disagree. But yeah, I think it's because we take them on that journey, Anne-Marie. we introduce the idea of testing. We have a huge focus on risk, and I love it in the class when you mention the word risk. Everyone like looks at you like, what? We don't talk about risk anymore. And it's like, well, you should, and we need to. So I think introducing the terminology back to them, they really do get on board, and they can follow that journey. And also with the direction of being able to automate at a much lower level, they really have great ideas of what can be done lower down the stack. They may not have know the tools or the right terminology, let's say, but because they built it, they have a very good insight into where we can do some automation and where we can't.
Yeah, that's been my experience too, and I think that would be something that would be really useful. Do you go into much about, and you talked about tokens, do you go into much about authentication and authorization or aspects of that, Richard, or is that something that you expect people to know before they come into the class?
So again, as we mentioned, it's experiential. So we do it based on RESTful Booker. So the way RESTful Booker authenticates is with quite a simple API that gives back a token, which is set as a cookie. So the framing of the class is around this tool. So obviously other applications have very different levels of complications, but we do have an API that you have to pass authentication to, otherwise it will kick you out. So we cover it as a level, but again, we can't teach every implementation of authorization. So we built a system that has it, and we teach people to think about it. So if you are going to do an API call or an API check, how does the API know it's someone that should trust? So we do think about it, but we don't teach every different way of doing it. We focus on RESTful Booker because that's the framing for the class.
Cool. So one of the things, actually, I was at CAS 2019 and we had an exploratory testing peer conference afterwards. And one of the topics that came up after this was can you do exploratory testing in automation, and where might that happen? Do you have any thoughts about that? And if so, is that something that you look at in the class?
So I'm going to answer that in two phases. So I think the first one is I've met a load of SEDETs, so many SEDETs who claim that they don't do any exploratory testing, and it always tickles me because by its very nature of designing an automated check, you have to explore the system. And usually you're exploring it from an angle that you don't normally do. You're looking in dev tools, you're looking under the hood, you're looking at API calls, you're using proxies to see the order that these calls are made in. You're not necessarily focused on the outcome anymore. You're focused on how it actually works, which in turn leads to a load of things. And I've said it a few times in some of my talks that as an automation engineer, I found more bugs creating the scripts than the scripts found themselves. So I think there's huge amounts of exploration that can be done whilst creating checks. And if anything, I think it's a skill to keep yourself in check. Like, because I am also a skilled exploratory tester, I have been known to, be automating a simple scenario, and 2 hours later, I'm surrounded by all these classes digging into the code, and I've completely gone off track, but I'm discovering something useful. The second part of the answer is what we do on day 3. And you can have a skilled exploratory tester, a skilled tester, a critical thinker, a great problem solver. But if you then arm them with some incredible tools, they can work at very rapid pace. They can dig deeper. For example, if you're doing a lot of exploratory testing on the UI and you've got a little tool that's on the side that's spitting out the log files for you, making you aware when there's been an error in the log files, if you've got a little window that's showing you all the API calls in real time, if you arm that exploratory tester with all these tools and these dashboards and this, basically information, if you have tools running alongside that person who's exploratory testing, all that information, they can digest it in real time and they can make new decisions on the direction they're taking their exploratory testing. And like I said, a lot of exploratory testers will already be using tools. They've probably just not made the connection about how important they are to their exploratory testing and what the right tools really allow you to dig a lot deeper. I think Mark talks about an example when he worked at HMRC. where he built a little dashboard. He didn't mean to build a dashboard. Originally, he built a tool which followed, you hit one microservice, and then obviously the way this was architected, it funneled down another 20 or 30 microservices. And when it failed, Mark didn't know where it had failed. So he built a little logging tool that would follow the data through all the microservices. And then he visualized it in a dashboard. So he could literally pump some data into the system and follow it all the way through the different microservices until it came out the other end, either in a pass or a fail. And that meant he could do exploratory scenarios rapidly because he was able to find when they failed. So yeah, you can't get away from it. Whether they like to admit it, you can't get away from it.
Yeah, that's been my experience too. Certainly, I can identify with the having to explore initially in order to be able to create the chests in the first place. So, what about something like, what about automation frameworks? And it's sort of said that that's a unique skill in itself, sort of knowing patterns to help create a framework versus actually creating the tests. Do you touch on that?
Yeah, we do. So there's like we lie to people on day one and we tell them that we don't know anything about testing, which most of them would obviously not fall for. But we have examples in the code base. It's all open source. We're full of different patterns and different tools that automate on different themes, and we've done it in different languages as well. Because a big part of the class is we don't dictate the language or the tools that you use. Excuse me. The language and tools that you use is dictated by day one when you look at your testability. So if you've got a team and there's 4 .NET developers and 2 JavaScript developers, then they might decide as a team that it's best to go down the route of using a .NET framework and libraries because there's more experience in the team. On top of that, we do talk a little bit about the designs, but we don't really get an awful lot of time to dig into a great deal because we want people to build the checks and see the results. So, we never really get into the dealings of, having hundreds of checks and being able to maintain them all. But we do talk about the aspects of maintainability and what you obviously following good design patterns, and people demo their solutions back, and there's an opportunity there to explain why they've made certain decisions that they've made. But yeah, we don't have an awful lot of time in the class. It's only 3 days, but we do have a lot of support online to help people with following good design patterns.
Yeah, I imagine you can sort of take away some of the material, is it? Or is that available then afterwards so that, you can continue practicing if you wanted to?
Yeah, so everything's handed over, slides, documents, files, and the test applications is permanently hosted. So you can actually go to automation and testing.online, and there's a permanently hosted instance on there. And also if you have, you can also download it locally and keep running the application yourself. And as I said, it's full of examples, and we built it as a genuine application. We do have suites. I say suites. We do have collections of checks that do test RESTful Booker. Obviously, because it's a real product, it's on a pipeline. But obviously, in the class, we pretend that there isn't any. So yeah, it's full of examples, lots of advice on there. And me and Mark are both very open. You can contact us, after the class, and we're more than happy to help people out.
Awesome, that's great. Thanks, Richard. I'll just open it up if anyone has any questions. Feel free to put them in the chat. I'm sure, Richard, you can read them out if you see them there.
Yeah, type them in the chat, or there's a ask a question panel, either or.
So do you have any questions for me?
I do. Right. So obviously I don't live in Australia. So where do you think Sydney is at, or Australia, with its adoption of automation?
That's a great question. I think there's a huge variety. For me, you'll see some of the top tech companies. I mean, we have our figurehead Atlassian here, who really have created I guess, a mini culture of tech companies that sort of are in that circle. And certainly they're looking at a lot of more, I guess, cutting edge type approaches to automation. I think that this whole concept of developers doing test automation is gaining traction in that circle. But on the other hand, we also have a lot of investment in construction, mining, banking, and some of those areas aren't necessarily able to be as adaptable and take on some of these new approaches as quickly as they would like. So you might have a lot of companies looking at, wanting to do some of this, but restricted because, they still have legacy systems and things like that in place. So it's a real mix in that case. We have a huge amount of offshoring over here as well. So you'll find that most of the major banks will have people in the Philippines testing, or it'll have them working in India or China. So that involves in itself, has its own, I guess, brings its own risk profile because of that. That needs to be considered when we're doing when we're talking about test automation, or we're talking about being able to release rapidly, and certainly there's a lot of opportunity, I would say, to be able to help assist in that space, because I think can be a real challenge, distributed teams, and being able to have that working smoothly. Though I have to say that there's a huge amount of effort put in to try and help with that distribution, and to try and work harmoniously together. So people put a lot of effort into making sure remote teams are able to communicate with other teams, and that there's effort put in to try and keep those teams working together. But you still have those challenges that are created because of the distance and the time zones and things like that. We have a question here.
We do. All right. So, Dave, I'll start with question 2. And if you could give me a little bit more explanation of what you mean by a product module simulator, that would be helpful. So I'll start with question 2. So the usefulness of the test automation pyramid. So I actually did a talk about this, literally in April it was, and I'm going to grab a link and I will share that here. So this talk is, well, it's funny enough, it's called Pyramidization. I don't have issues with the test automation pyramid as long as it's used as an heuristic. I don't think it can be used as a strategy. The reason it can't be used as a strategy is it lacks testability. There is no emphasis in the pyramid about whether you have the skills to pull that off, or if your product even fits the pyramid. What if your product is just an API? Like, how many layers can you actually really dig into an API? The controller, the model, and the DB. Yeah, sure, you could do that. But as a heuristic, if you've got a full stack application and you've got a pyramid that's tailored to your domain, you can use it to say, how are we doing? Well, let's have a look. We seem to have 100 UI checks, 10 API checks, and only 50 unit ones. Is that acceptable to us? Are we happy with that? And if we are, then we say, fine. We might be happy with it because that's what our testability dictates. If we're not happy with it, then we have conversations and plans in place to say, well, how can we improve it? So I don't think people should be using it as a strategy. because it lacks so much context and so much testability insights that you can go on a full errands. Like imagine telling a team that's really skilled in Selenium, let's say, that they've got a couple of weeks to go and implement a full-blown API framework. That's not going to end well, just because the strategy said that they need to move it. So, because the pyramid says that, sorry. So yeah, we need to look at the skills in the team. And if you end up more looking like a T, then so be it. But it is, I don't think it is useful as a strategy. It is useful more as a heuristic. Simulate a handheld medical device. Oh, okay. So what I will say is we don't go into specifics like that, but we do talk a lot about, so Dave's elaborated on his question a little bit. And the original question was, do you have guidelines in creating product module simulators, which I believe is a prerequisite for software test automation. And he's elaborated a bit more about things like handheld medical devices. So what we don't go into that explicitly, but we do break down things to see where are the risks. So obviously underneath that handheld device, there's a little computer running some software. So are you trying to test the computer running the software, or are you trying to test the usage of the device? So obviously we can get that down, breaking down the layers I mentioned with this task analysis idea we have. But you do need to get to a point where, you need a stable environment, or you need an environment that is as realistic as it needs to be for the testing that you're doing. So if you can spin up the operating system and load the software without the actual physical device, then obviously that will give you some insight, but that won't be truly representative of the device itself, which might have limited RAM or whatever. It's like when you get a lot of people doing mobile automation, they spin up, 10 iPhone simulators on their $4,000 powerful Mac, and then wonder why the performance of the real application is less when people actually get it on their phone. But again, that's a different risk. If you're looking for functionality, we can solve that another way. If you're looking performance, we can do it another way. So it comes back to design, back to what we're trying to test. However, I will share a really interesting insight from a guy on the course. He came to, I think, the first one actually in Brighton, and he worked for a very well-known headphone manufacturer. And he, in his head, he had to automate the headphones. He wanted to test that the volume goes up and the volume goes down, and that you can connect with the Bluetooth. That's what he wanted to test. And he was really seriously considering building a robot, like a little arm, to press the buttons on this. And when we broke it down and we realized that he just wanted to check the calls, we went and found a library that simulates Bluetooth calls. And he was able to go away and build a framework that was able to simulate the functionality of the headphones, but obviously not the user experience and how good the buttons are. But that was a different risk, and he was able to mitigate that in a different way. So I would answer no, we don't go into specific handheld solutions. It is a web app that we use throughout the class, but the thinking and the philosophy behind what we go through can be applied to any product in any domain.
So I have, I'm going to just kind of go off script here, Richard. Our script is so lined out beforehand. But I was, when I was at CAST, one of the things that we were talking about, and I've heard this before from Matt Fellows. I went to a talk where Matt Fellows from DS was talking about the automation, basically testing in, things like Lambda, and looking at the concept of that, the testing that we're doing in when you've got a continuous deployment environment, that you're basically, the concept of unit testing is sort of disappearing, and that that really there's a whole new world out there that's really challenging how we think about our testing and how we manage that. I just wondered, maybe this is not something in your course, but what are your thoughts on that space, and where you think automation is going in there?
So again, ignoring the specific, tools and things, without a doubt, the tools are changing. We can get what I said. I call them seams. So people call them layers. I call them seams because in some way they are woven together like a blanket. So while they're not, we like to write things so that they can be taken apart quite easily. There still is usually some logic on either side, which is stitching them together. So the reason I bring that up is how do we define it? We tend to look at I wonder if I can actually show you. I think it might be easier for me. Seeing as we don't have a script, let's just completely change what we do. So I am just going to go and find some slides from the class because, why not? And the reason I want to do it is the visualization that we produce, I think, really helps explain this a little better. So here. So let me make that full screen. There we go. So this is what I mentioned about the visual task analysis. So if you break down a flow through an application and you realize that the thing you care about is at a certain seam and a certain layer, if you can test directly here and you can mock everything under here, in theory, I believe you have a unit test because the tools allow you to do that. So you're not going over this barrier, this seam, and you're not going over this seam. You're able to get at it in complete isolation. So that's where the difference starts to form in my head. And then obviously, if you go across two seams, you could argue you've got an integration test because they're covering what happens when you go over the seam. And then finally, we have the infamous end-to-end scenario. So yes, I do think the concept of a unit test being, down in the models and the controllers has changed because we've now pushed some of that logic into the UI. Tools like React have made it possible to create really small targeted JavaScript tests. So yeah, I think that the world of these tools is constantly changing the way how we perceive the types of tests that we can and can't execute. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, Anne-Marie, but that's what I said.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by it. I mean, I think that, even when you look at sort of people now deploying, rather than looking at stories, people are looking at deploying, small amounts, even smaller than a story. So they're just really going into tasks that are not necessarily identifiable as something from the UI. And then that raises the question of, how do I test something like this? Because I don't necessarily have a product anymore to test. I'm testing really a very, very specific piece of code. And, the questions that I need to ask around that, I don't have that context necessarily of a product anymore. And I think that's really challenging us to rethink a lot about, how we do testing and how we think about our test automation as well. So it was. Well,
you've just given me a fantastic insight that if Mark was watching now, he'd be screaming at me. I don't know if I can get that model back easily enough. No, probably not. So on that model, one thing that Mark usually remembers, and I always forget, is the concept of the actor. So we're very used as the testers to thinking of the actor as the user. So which is why we're obsessed with the top down, the whole product, the interface. Whereas actually, if you think of the actor as other parts of your system, then you can start to see, well, who's going to consume this piece of code? So I've just deployed an API and no one's using it right now. However, can I then go, right, well, the actor in the future could be the UI, it could be an AP, it could be an IoT device, it could be a mobile app. So I'm going to go and simulate being one of them by using an API tool. Again, it could be a serverless function. You can think, who is going to be the actor of this? Because you're never deploying it for the sake of it, right? You're not deploying a function just to sit there and do nothing. Something is going to consume it. So what is that it? Who is that actor? And once you identify the actor, it usually dictates the tooling. So like I said, if you decide the actor is the user, you need to use the interface they're going to use. If the actor is another piece of software, how are they going to call your product, your service? Are they going to make HTTP calls? Then we need a HTTP tool. Are they going to use things like RabbitMQ, or are they going to go straight to a DB, or whatever the protocol is? We will know that up front. And therefore, yes, that dictates our tool. So the actor is really important.
Yeah, I think this is why sort of understanding your structure and your architecture and everything are becoming so important to how we test today. And, really, they say it's all about context. It's just our context has really changed quite significantly, I think.
I couldn't agree more. There's one important aspect off the back of that is this emphasis on coding. So if anyone who comes to the class, and I hope some people do come to the class, we spend about 40% maybe of our time actually in tools or writing code to drive other tools. Because again, we don't dictate the tools. If you don't know how to code, this class is still perfectly valid because you'll use a tool that defines by your testability. So again, if your testability says we can't write code, then you go and find tools that have a different interface that you can use. So, I throw myself off track. Yeah, no, the reason I brought that up is there's a huge level of technical knowledge needed to do exactly what we both just described, to model an application, to visualize it, to understand how AWS and serverless works, and what the proxy do and what RabbitMQ is up to. There's a huge level of skill there that you don't need to know the implementation you don't need to know how to implement it. You need to have the understanding of how it does work so that you can then strategize. And that's a whole different set of skills, whereas we're so fixated on pushing people to code, whereas actually there's so much to gain by just having a technical mindset and digging a little bit deeper, as you said, to find out how these things work, as opposed to how do I implement them. Very different set of skills.
I love how you just described that. I mean, for me, it's absolutely, tick, 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 tick. It's really, I look at some of the skill sets that I have, and I've constantly just reapplied them in a slightly different way, because once I've understood that it's a different context, and that once I start understanding that context better, and I did this definitely when I was looking at microservices and testing in that space, and then you start identifying exactly where you can apply your testing mindset. So yeah, thanks for that. I'm just going to open again up to anyone else if they've got any other questions, because I think we'll sort of start wrapping up shortly. Is there anything else you want to add about your super duper course, and anything else you want to say about it?
I would just say the final thing is, as I mentioned, it's experiential. Me and Mark love a bit of fun. We don't working in IT, life. It's all about enjoying yourself. So, this isn't a sit down and follow Richard and Mark course. This is we guide you and you work in teams, and it's wherever it goes, it goes. So there's no right answers for this course. Whatever happens was the right thing to happen. On top of that, we're trying to provide an approach and a mindset. So we call AIT, automation and testing, we call it a namespace and a mindset. So within our namespace, we have words that mean certain things, and we have ideas, and we have philosophies and strategies. It doesn't mean that that's the right way to do it. So we're trying to provide people with, an experience which they can then reconstruct to apply to any domain out there. As soon as you enter a new company, you can use the same approach. Well, I need to model the application. I need to understand how it works. I need to know the technology. All those steps, you will remember the experience that you had on AIT, and then you can reapply them to your new context. And also, we make it very open. We like demos. We get people to share their work. We try and make it as interactive, as fun as possible. We've worked really hard with the education boss at Ministry of Testing, Sarah. She's helped us create fun, engaging activities. It's not the same all 3 days. I've been on so many courses that, okay, Richard talks for 30 minutes, you do what Richard just said for 30 minutes, and then we rinse and repeat. We don't do that. It's fun, it's mixed up, it's engaging, and it is experiential, so it goes whichever way you want it to go. And we share, finally, we throw in a lot of stories as well. So me and Mark share real practical experiences that were in recent times, not from 20 years ago. These are things that have been happening in recent times with modern, recent technology, and we share our experiences in those spaces.
So, Kerr, do you need to have a beard in order to attend AIT?
Not at all, but it helps when you're a bit stuck and you just sit there pondering. No beards needed for AIT. To be honest, Mark doesn't have a beard. He thinks he does, but he doesn't. It's a lame attempt at a beard. He's just lazy. No beards required.
What about trim then? I mean, how can you execute trim if you don't have a beard?
You can trim many things, you could trim how much time you spend procrastinating. You could trim your hair. You could trim the amount of coffee you consume. There's lots of things to trim. Trim actually, we never made the connection to the beards with trim. If anyone's wondering what trim is, it's a mnemonic for helping you design valuable automation. So it's targeted, reliable, informative, maintainable, and speedy. And we elaborate on that in the class. But yeah, Anne-Marie's making references to trimming stuff. The beard's here to stay, Anne-Marie. It's not going away. It's a part of me now. I
know. We'll see. We'll see if the Australian weather can tempt you to, trim it more. Yeah. I think that's about it. I think it's probably a good point to wrap up, sure. Unless I'm not seeing any more questions from the chat, but unless anyone's got a final question, we'll roll it up here and let you go to bed, Richard.
Yeah, my final point would be, if you've got any questions after this, you can get hold of me on Twitter and Ministry of Testing Slack and various places. As we mentioned, the course is on those dates. It's in the centre of Sydney at Fishburners. I think that's correct, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
So yeah, there's still plenty of spaces available. It was the only current iteration we have of this class in Australia. There's currently no plans to do any more. We hope there will be, but at the moment, this is the one opportunity to attend this course this year if you are based in Australia. So yeah, also, if you can let other people know about it, we'd really appreciate it. But it is a great 3 days, and I think this would be our 12th or 13th iteration, and people love the class. So please do come along.
Yep. Okay. Thanks a million, Richard. And thanks to everyone for turning up, whether it be late at night or early in the morning. It's much appreciated to have you here online. We'll be taking this and we'll be making it available. Is that right, Richard?
I'll give it to you, yeah, and you can do what you like with it. We can maybe trim it up and use bits of it in places. But yeah, we'll put it somewhere because I think it was good fun. We could stick it on YouTube, maybe.
Yeah, maybe we could do that. Yeah. Okay, super. Thanks a million. All the best. Thanks, everyone.
Enjoy your day.